Our supply chains are breaking down on a very basic level. While there's a widespread shortage of goods and many products are not arriving where they need to be when they need to be there, a shortage of workers is spreading across every corner of the industry, and global leaders are now being warned if conditions do not improve, the world's ocean transport system is gonna collapse. Hundreds of thousands of sailors have left their jobs since the onset of the health crisis due to chronic underpayment, lack of assistance, and exceedingly long work hours. To make things worse, many were unable to enter their countries and come back home after having finished their contracts simply because they had not been vaccinated in what was known as the crew change crisis. Now, thousands of sailors are currently stranded physically on immense cargo ships, living in the worst possible conditions you can imagine. They have been forgotten by their leaders, forgotten by their country, and forgotten by their employers. The United Nations calls it a humanitarian crisis, and according to a new dossier published by the Wall Street Journal, the problem hasn't started over the past year and a half, but almost a decade ago. The global trade disruptions that erupted as a result of the health outbreak only aggravated the problem. Trillions in government stimulus have contributed to an unprecedented spike in consumer demand, but our stressed supply chains and millions of supply chain workers simply cannot handle the gigantic volume of goods arriving every day anymore. They're reaching their breaking point. However, long before the virus spread all over the planet, shipping companies were already overwhelming these workers, whose labor is absolutely essential to global trade, but whose faces remain invisible. Over the past decade, an increasing number of carriers have abandoned their own vessels due to mounting debts, including older vessels considered too costly to repair. And that's caused a devastating rise in the number of crew members simply being abandoned at sea, often left without resources to survive as they await pay for the work they have done, but most times the pay does not come. In the investigative report, the Wall Street Journal described the shocking reality of thousands of crew members that were literally left adrift after companies abandoned, sold, or transferred vessels or simply could not pay their debts. These workers struggle to find food, to find water, to find other essential resources even while moored close to resort locations in places such as Dubai, or in some cases while stuck at Black Sea ports. The $14 trillion shipping industry, responsible for 90% of world trade, has left in its wake what appears to be a record number of cargo ship castaways, the report highlights. Abandonment cases accounted when ship owners failed to pay crews 2 or more months in wages, or don't cover the cost to send crew members home. And that's according to the International Maritime Organization, which is the United Nations agency. The UN revealed that the number of abandoned sailors has doubled in 2020. It will probably grow once again in 2021 as hundreds of thousands cannot re-enter their countries due to the lack of vaccination. The exact number of international crew members that are currently abandoned is still unknown, because many of them are still reluctant to come forward for fear of not getting hired by other freight companies. Only last month, the industry labor union, International Transport Workers Federation, reported that over 1,000 more sailors were left adrift. But according to the WSJ, the total number of those left aboard container ships and bulk carriers whose transport operations have been halted is in the range of the hundreds of thousands. Even though many of those who became castaways overnight have chosen to stay aboard those ships until they get paid, in many cases they are legally forbidden to disembark due to complex local laws that determine policies of many ports. Some governments require sailors to remain aboard as guarantors until ship owners pay port authorities, for berth fees and other charges. Sailors also refuse to disembark, convinced they will never recoup months or years of lost wages if they leave their ships. Seafarers stuck on board generally borrow money from friends and family to feed themselves and feed their crewmates, explains the report. Thousands say they will stay aboard until the ship is sold for scrap, a process that can take years, but they cannot go back home empty-handed. Some survive on rice and water for an entire year, and with the help of nearby ships and people on land, others can stay aboard for years. The report even mentioned the case of one engineer that has been aboard a stranded tanker on the Black Sea for 4 years. Abandoned sailors often describe the ships as a prison in which they have been forced to work for years without any compensation. The WSJ documented one ongoing saga off Romania in the Black Sea, involving several crew members awaiting the resolution of a high-level Romanian court case to determine who is responsible for payment of debts involving
Velcro brand Easy Hang Straps. Where will original thinking take you? Velcro brand.
Relax and take a bite-sized vacation with Mounds.
the ship's owner. Legally, they simply aren't allowed off the vessel, says the report. In some cases, these unpaid workers literally face starvation. Anchored ships that have been hurt by storms with crew aboard but remain unable to disembark are yet another dramatic example of how the lives and safety of thousands of sailors are threatened. The WSJ report exposed that off the coast of Yemen, one of the world's largest oil supertankers, laden with 1.1 million barrels of crude, sits decaying in a war zone. An errant rocket or the ship's corroding steel hull could trigger an explosion and a massive spill. Several exporting nations, including China, Indonesia, and the Philippines, are putting up efforts to tackle this crisis by establishing an abandonment fund to help with emergency assistance for the stranded crew. But that could enable companies to continue to neglect these workers and push aside their responsibility, as it's been happening over the past decade. With hundreds of thousands of seafarers now stranded at sea and unable to disembark from the ships they operate or used to operate, the United Nations has issued a humanitarian crisis warning to global leaders, urging them to send help to bring these workers home. Unable to go to shore, repatriate and change crews, and without access to medical care, seafarers face a humanitarian crisis that jeopardizes the safety and future of shipping, said United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He has recently appealed to governments to formally appoint seafarers and other marine personnel as key workers, ensuring safe crew changes, implement established protocols, and allow stranded seafarers to be repatriated. He said these critical workers must have access to national vaccination programs, and provisions should be made to vaccinate international seafarers at designated ports. Recently, some of the world's biggest shipping and transport organizations urged for help from the United Nations, arguing the supply chain crisis may escalate to a whole new level if governments fail to send aid to sailors and other supply chain workers in time. An act that could lead to the total collapse of the global transport system, they warned. In an open letter sent last week to the World Health Organization and Internal Labor Organization, numerous groups that represent over 65 million global transport workers exposed that governments around the world are leaving them unassisted. According to the American Shipper website, the letter was signed by the International Road Transport Union, the International Air Transport Association, the International Chamber of Shipping, and the International Transport Workers Federation. Combined, these organizations represent around 3.5 million freight and airport companies, more than 80% of the world's merchant shipping fleet, and handle over $20 trillion of the world's annual trade. The organizations are requesting the heads of government take swift action to lift botched travel rules and provide vaccinations to the manufacturing and logistics workforces. The letter also defends the creation of globally recognized vaccination certificates so that workers are allowed to cross international borders. This letter comes as an increasing number of seafarers hit their breaking point after having to cope with strict travel restrictions, problematic crew changes, lack of vaccination and testing, and of course lack of financial compensation, even though they've still kept the supply chain moving this entire time. In view of the vital role that transport workers have played during the health crisis and continue to play during the ongoing supply chain crisis, we request, as a matter of urgency, a meeting with World Health Organization and Internal Labor Organization at the highest level to identify solutions before global transport systems collapse, the letter said. We also ask that WHO and the ILO raise this at the UN General Assembly and call on heads of government to take meaningful and swift action to resolve this crisis now. At this moment, the whole world is facing a shortage of workers in all transport sectors, the letter added, and expect more to leave as a result of the poor treatment millions have faced during the virus outbreak, putting the supply chain under greater threat. In addition to the devastating impact this crisis is having on the lives of hundreds of thousands of stranded maritime workers, millions of people all over the planet can also be affected by the consequences of this situation, as the supply chain crisis intensifies and pushes the price of everything to new record highs. As Go Banking Rates reported, supply chain bottlenecks have contributed to rampant inflation in the United States, with corporate giants like Nike, Costco, FedEx, UPS, and General Mills warning that unless continued supply chain problems were solved, consumers should brace for even higher inflation as the holidays approach. Mohammed El Arian, an advisor to the insurance giant Allianz and president of Queen's College, Cambridge, says this is a clear warning that the world economy is about to slump while prices will continue to rise quickly. That's a doomsday double whammy that almost sank the global economy back in the 1970s. The supply chain problems are much more persistent than most policymakers expected. Governments are having to rethink quickly because the three elements, supply side, transport, labor, are coming together to blow a stagflationary wind through the global economy, he stressed. In short, as our leaders continue to fail to assist those in need, we're on track to see the supply chain chaos sliding out of control very soon, and the flow of goods between countries is at risk of being halted for an indefinite period of time. That's why you should start preparing for the turbulence ahead while you still can, because time is almost up.